We are pleased to be joined by author and researcher Ralph Ellis. Let us begin to unpack some of your interesting biblical research, Ralph, by first exploring the concept of what is referred to as the biblical Exodus. In your opinion, Ralph, what caused the biblical Exodus?
In a word, Santorini, or Thera, as they call it, which is the big volcano in the Mediterranean. So we come here to the sort of nub of the whole problem of both the Old Testament and the New Testament, is that within the Old Testament, they try to portray a story which is totally disconnected from history. And the whole purpose of these books, and now there's about 10 of them in the series, I think, is to put biblical history back into real history, because at present it's as if biblical history happened on a different planet. And that's just not tenable. You've either got two choices here at present. Either the entire story is fictional and it's been made up, which some people, of course, do subscribe to, or there is elements of history in it, and we've just been looking in the wrong place or the wrong era for that history. And the Exodus is one of those items that it's very easy to discover in the historical record. All you have to do is shift the timeline a little bit. And the cause of the Exodus was, of course, as we know, the plagues. And the plagues were caused by the eruption of Santorini. Now, Santorini was the largest volcanic eruption in the Mediterranean in probably the last 7,000 years. Certainly within recent history, since 2000 BC, there has never been another volcano like Santorini in the Mediterranean. And how do we know that the Exodus was caused by Santorini? Well, because the Old Testament, the Torah, tells us. Moses says to his people, as God told him. So he says to his people, I will take handfuls of ash from the fire, and I will throw them into the air, and they will become a small dust across the land of Egypt. There is no better description you could possibly get of the long-range fallout from a large volcanic eruption. Small ash falling across the land of Egypt. And of course, the other plague that after the plagues, the other major event that happened, was the Israelites being led by a column of fire and a column of smoke, and the waters parting. Now, the waters parting is quite obviously a tsunami. So we have three elements there all together. We have an ash fall, we have a large cloud that is maybe a fire cloud as well as just being an ash cloud, and we have the waters being parted. And this is a perfect description of the effects, the long-range effects that would have hit Egypt from Santorini, which is about 900 kilometers away. Furthermore, we know it's true because ancient man could not have guessed this sequence of events. It's very, very difficult for someone to have envisaged that a volcano would cause not only ashfall and a large pillar of cloud, but the water to recede. That's very difficult. How would anyone know, if they had not witnessed it, that a tsunami will cause the sea to rush out before it comes back in again to consume the army that's following you, maybe. It has to be an eyewitness account of that particular event. And we know that the Santorini event was would have had the sea rushing out because it was a subduction volcano. The volcano collapsed, and of course that will cause the sea to move out before it moves back in again. So quite clearly, we have a first-hand a first-hand description of the long-range effects of Santorini, and it was that caused the Exodus. That was the main event, and the Exodus itself was caused by the political ramifications of that event. It caused a political dispute within Egypt. And that was, in some senses, the basis, the actual foundations upon which the Bible was founded, because this is the first event. We're skipping Genesis for a minute. We'll discuss Genesis a little bit later on. But this was the first event, really, within the annals of the Israelites as they became known that caused the production of the Torah.
As we move further along in the biblical chronology, Ralph, is there historical evidence for what the Bible and Torah refer to as the Israelites in Egypt?
Yes, they were there, and again we have the evidence from the actual Bible itself. So, what this eruption caused, as I said, was a political dispute, and we have a record of that political dispute, and that dispute was actually between the Theban Egyptians and the northern Egyptians, the lower Egyptians, who were called the Hyksos. And we know that this event was connected with the Exodus because we have a stela which records elements of the Exodus. Correction, it records elements of the plagues, and yes, I suppose it does record elements of the Exodus as well upon it. It records the building of the tabernacle, basically. And this is called the Ahmosi stela, the stela of Ahmosi I. And so we're talking about 1570 odd BC here. And the main event that Ahmosi I is known for is for the expulsion of the Hyksos. So there was an exodus, a real historical exodus, and it's called the Hyksos Exodus. And I won't go through all the details of it because we don't have enough time for this. But the patriarchs in the Bible, of course, were called shepherds, or they were all known as shepherds. That's pretty much the sort of generic term for all of the patriarchs within the Torah. And of course, the Hyksos were known as the shepherd kings. And we know that the Israelites were the Hyksos shepherd kings because, again, we have the evidence from the Torah itself. Well, actually, the second edition of the Torah, which is the one written by Josephus Flavius. So we have this example of Abraham, one of the patriarchs of the Israelites, of course. And in the Bible, it says that Abraham, who was a shepherd, had 318 servants. Well, that's a bit strange for a shepherd. You know, there's not many shepherds with a few starving sheep on the top of a hill somewhere who have 318 servants. But Josephus Flavius, in his edition, and remember his edition of the Torah is much older than the current edition we have, he goes one step further, and he says that Abraham had 318 army officers. Now, that is very strange for any shepherd to have 318 army officers and an army of unlimited manpower. Now, there was only one group of shepherds in the 1500s BC who had such an army, and they were the shepherd kings, the Hyksos. So, in answer to your question, who were the Israelites? They were the Hyksos. And these were a group of people that we know about quite a lot in history. They were a group of people who were living mainly in Lower Egypt, that's northern Egypt. They are thought to have been immigrants into Egypt who took over northern Egypt, and they were expelled by Ahmosi I in a great exodus. And that great exodus is the biblical exodus. And we don't have time to go through all the comparisons here, but you can rest assured that all of the details are exactly the same in both.
Can you expand on this discrepancy of the chronology, please?
Yes, that's interesting, because the Genesis story actually probably comes after the Exodus. That's why I started this sort of discussion with the Exodus, because it actually happened about 300 years later. If we look at the evidence by Manetho, who was an Egyptian historian, he writes quite a lot about these subjects, and he said there were two exoduses out of Egypt, not one. And basically the Torah has conflated the two exoduses into one. And so we move on about 300 years from the time of Ahmosi I and the Hyksos, and we come to the very influential era of Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. And my theory on the Genesis story, because I thought initially we would not be able to understand where the Genesis story came from because it's so it's so fantastical. I thought there would be no history in it. But on reading it and rereading it, it struck me that it was exactly the same as the hymn to the Aten. So what I did is I went through it bit by bit, reading it and reading it back in the original Egyptian as well. And it does look as though it is almost a complete copy of the hymn to the Aten, which was written by Pharaoh Akhenaten, of course. This is about 1350 BC. Pharaoh Akhenaten, of course, becoming the first monotheist, which is another similarity, of course, to the Israelites. And of course, Akhenaten's brother was called Moses. So again, we have another similarity. So what's happened, I think, here is that someone got hold of this story, and they looked at it and they thought, well, actually, this looks like a creation epic, because in reality, the hymn to the Aten is about the dawning of a new day. But if you read it quickly, it sort of sounds like the creation of the earth instead of the dawning of a new day. And so what I think happened is that some scribe, deliberately or otherwise, put this at the beginning of the biblical story as a creation epic, when it was not a creation epic at all. And therefore, the people within this creation epic, that's, Adam and Eve, are actually Pharaoh Akhenaten and Queen Nefertiti. And again, I can't go through all of the evidence in the time available, but take it from me that the evidence is very good. But I'll give you one snippet, of course, that Adam and Eve were always said to be naked within the Garden of Eden. Now, if we look at the Amarna story, that's the story of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. Akhenaten and Nefertiti were always naked. They were portrayed as being naked within the Garden of Aten. So we have a love couple naked in the story in the Garden of Eden, and a love couple naked in the Garden of Aten. So quite obviously, Eden and Aten are the same. So the Garden of Eden is actually the Garden of Aten, the garden of the sun god Aten, who was the main god, the only god of Pharaoh Akhenaten. So this is the basis of the Genesis story. And again, it takes Israelite history, Jewish history, back into Egypt. They were the Hyksos, and they were Pharaoh Akhenaten and Nefertiti, who were related to the Hyksos, of course. They came from Lower Egypt, the same as the Hyksos did. So we're beginning to set a trend here that all of the biblical events came out of Egypt, and they are real history of events, of real events within Egypt. And we've skipped over some of them because there are many more. But there are elements within the Joseph story, Joseph, him of the coat of many colors, where it appears that we have verbatim conversations between Joseph and Pharaoh that have come down to us over 3,500 years, which I think is quite amazing. And we have their actual conversations as they were made at the time, because they make sense if you know what they were talking about. And of course, we were not talking about shepherds looking after sheep here. So we have to reinterpret this in terms of Egyptian theology. But the entire Bible is becoming recognizable as a story of Egypt. Not just any old story of Egypt, but a story of the kings of Egypt. So basically what I'm saying is it was the day book. The pharaohs of Egypt used to keep a day book, which was a book of the events and the people within the royal court. And the Torah is that book, is the day book. It keeps a history of the royal family, the Hyksos royal family of Egypt.
Ralph, one of the most enduring and often misunderstood event locations in the biblical lexicon is Mount Sinai. Can you please provide any information on this important biblical setting?
Yeah, well, this is another of these oddities within the whole of the biblical narrative, where these essential components of their history are missing. And this is very strange because the Jews record everything. You know, every prince, every queen, every prostitute, every event that was going in this era. And then they lose their sacred mountain. Very strange, isn't it? And so they point at various mountains in the Sinai Peninsula. But you could never get 500,000 people living in the Sinai Peninsula for more than 4 days, let alone 40 years, because it's a desert. They would die. So this event needs interpretation. It didn't happen as advertised. So what was happening here? Well, we have an exodus out of Egypt. We had a big first exodus. We had a small second exodus, which was the exodus of Akhenaten and the people of Amarna. And they were coming out of Egypt. Now, if you look at the ancient records, even Josephus actually, when he says Egypt, he's normally talking about Upper Egypt. He's talking about Thebes and Karnak. He is not talking about Lower Egypt. And so these people were coming out of Egypt and they go to Mount Sinai. And these are Egyptian people, fully Egyptian in the sense that the Hyksos were and Akhenaten was. So where is Mount Sinai? Where is there a mountain within Egypt? This is why people keep pointing at the Sinai Peninsula, because there are no mountains within Egypt. So where is there a mountain within Egypt that is sacred? Well, the answer is obvious, isn't it? The sacred mountain is the Great Pyramid of Giza. And so that's what Mount Sinai is. Mount Sinai is the Great Pyramid. And again, I can't go through all the evidence. We don't have time here, but I'll give you a couple of examples of the evidence. The first one is that at the bottom of Mount Sinai, it says, within the Torah, it says there was a pavement, a black pavement that looked like the night sky. And it was so flat and smooth, you had to take your shoes off before you went on it. So where would you find a mountain that had a black, smooth pavement that looked like the night sky? Well, again, the answer is the Great Pyramid of Giza, because if you go on the eastern face of the Great Pyramid, you will find the great black basalt pavement, which lay on the eastern face of the Great Pyramid, and it does indeed look like the night sky. So this is what they were talking about. And this explains so much, because this is the beauty of this set of re-evaluations of biblical history, because it starts explaining things. You know, it's not causing problems, it's explaining problems that were never explicable before. You could never get 500,000 people in the Sinai Peninsula for 40 years. They would die within 4 days. This explains what they were doing. They were at Sinai, and they were having a final ceremony there, circling the mountain, as it says in the Torah, circumnavigating the mountain before heading off on their exodus. And this circumnavigation, of course, is still performed at the Kaaba in Mecca, of course, where they have the great circumnavigation of the Kaaba when they go on their Hajj. It was an old type, very traditional type of celebration within these ancient religions, because what they were doing, and don't tell the Muslims this, but what they are doing at Mecca is they are imitating the stars and the planets and the motion of the cosmos around the celestial equator. So the Kaaba is the center of the earth, as it were, the celestial pole, and all of the stars, all of the people rotate around the Kaaba. It's a depiction. If you stood above it on one of the minarets, you would see a depiction of the night sky with all the people rotating around. And I was saying that this theory explains things, and it explains this 40 years phenomena. What's this 40 years all about? We have this number 40 crops up all the time. You know, Moses was in the wilderness for 40 days and nights, and Jesus was in the wilderness for 40 days and nights, and the Israelites were in Sinai for 40 years, and all this sort of business. What does it all mean? Well, again, we have to be slightly lateral and we have to be slightly logical about this. Don't take things at face value. You cannot be 40 years in the wilderness in Sinai. What it means is that the people who we are discussing and the events we are discussing are connected with the Great Pyramid. It's a sign of initiation. If you say your age is 40, or you were 40 days in the wilderness, it's a sign of initiation, that you were initiated into the Masonic secrets of the Great Pyramid. And the great secret of the Great Pyramid, well, not that it's a big secret today, of course, but it certainly was then, is that the Great Pyramid is a 40 times copy of pi. So if you get pi, the fractional equivalent, of course, 22 over 7, multiplied by 40, you get the dimensions of the Great Pyramid. And that's what they were talking about when they keep invoking the number 40 in their narrative. It was symbolic of the Great Pyramid. And so we doubly know now that Mount Sinai was the Great Pyramid. And of course, this makes so much more sense of the story. They were coming out of Egypt. That's Amarna, sort of in central Egypt. And they were going northwards past Giza on their exodus, and then ending up